Hello and welcome back. Today we are taking the first chapter from my favourite author Robin Cook, born 1940. I did want to start with his debut book, Year of the Intern, published 1972, but I can't find it at the moment. So, have decided to move on to his second novel, Coma, published 1977. Coma was also adapted into a movie starring a young Michael Douglas. If by any chance you do not know Robin Cook's books, they are medical thrillers, and he is the only author I never look to see what the book is about. I just buy them. So if you haven't read Robin Cook, I hope you will give his books a try. And here on chapter 1 we give you a taste of the author's books, not forgetting all links to where you can purchase Mr. Cook's books and other Prologue, February 14th, 1976. Nancy Greenlee lay on the operating table on her back, staring up at the large kettle-drum-shaped lights in operating room number 8, trying to be calm. She had had several pre-op injections, which she was told would make her sleepy and happy. She was neither. Nancy was more nervous and apprehensive than before the shots. Worst of all, she felt totally, completely, and absolutely defenseless. In all her 23 years, she had never before felt so embarrassed and so vulnerable. Covering her was a white linen bed sheet. The edge was frayed, and there was a small tear at the corner. That bothered her, and she didn't know why. Under the sheet, she had on one of those hospital gowns which tie behind the neck and descend only to the mid-thigh. The back was open. Other than that, there was only the sanitary napkin, which she knew was already soaked with her own blood. She hated and feared the hospital at that moment, and wanted to scream, to run out of the room and down the corridor. But she didn't. She feared the bleeding she had been experiencing more than the cruel detached environment of the hospital. Both made her acutely aware of her mortality, and that was something she rarely liked to face. At 7:11 on the morning of February 14th, 1976, the eastern sky over Boston was a chalky grey, and the bumper-to-bumper cars coming into the city had their headlights on. The temperature was 38 degrees, and the people in the streets walked quickly on their separate tracks. There were no voices, just the sound of the machines and the wind. Within the Boston Memorial Hospital things were different. The stark fluorescent lights illuminated every square inch of the OR area. The bustle of activity and excited voices lent credence to the dictum that surgery started at 7:30 sharp. That meant the scalpels actually cut the skin at 7:30. The patient fetching, the prep, the scrub, and the induction under anesthesia had to be all completed before 7:30. As a consequence, at 7:11, the activity in the OR area was in full swing, including room number 8. There was nothing special about number 8. It was a typical OR in the memorial. The walls were a neutral-coloured tile. The floors were a speckled vinyl. At 7:30, February 14th, 1976, a D&C, dilation and curettage, a routine gynecological procedure, was scheduled in room number 8. The patient was Nancy Greenlee. The anesthesiologist was Dr. Robert Billing, a second-year anesthesiology resident. The scrub nurse was Ruth Jenkins. The circulating nurse was Gloria Di Matteo. The surgeon was George Major, the new young partner of one of the older established OB/GYN men. And he was in the dressing room donning his surgical scrub suit, while the others were hard at work. Nancy Greenlee had been bleeding for 11 days. At first she passed it off as a normal period, despite the fact that it was several weeks early. There had been no premenstrual discomfort, maybe a vague cramp on the morning the first spotting occurred. But after that it had been a painless affair, waxing and waning. Each night she hoped to have seen the last of it, but had awakened to find the tampon soaked. The telephone conversations, first with Dr. Major's nurse, then with the doctor himself, had allayed her fears for progressively shorter and shorter durations. and it was a bother, a gigantic nuisance, and as it was with such things, it had come at a most inopportune time. She thought about Kim Devereux coming up to spend his spring break from Duclaw School with her in Boston. Her roommate had fortuitously made plans to spend that week skiing at Killington. Everything seemed to have been falling into beautiful romantic place, everything except the bleeding. There was no way Nancy could blithely dismiss it. She was a delicately angular and attractive girl with an aristocratic appearance. About her person she was fastidious. If her hair was the slightest bit dirty, she felt uneasy. So the continued bleeding made her feel messy, unattractive, out of control. Eventually it began to frighten her. Nancy remembered lying on the couch with her feet up on the arm, reading the editorial page of the Globe while Kim was in the kitchen making drinks. She had become aware of a strange sensation in her vagina. It was different from anything she had ever felt before. It felt as if she was being inflated by a warm, soft mass. There had been absolutely no pain or discomfort. At first she was perplexed as to the origin of the sensation, but then she felt a warmth on her inner thighs and a trickling of fluid run down into the recess of her buttocks. Without undue anxiety she recognized that she was bleeding very fast. Casually, without moving her body, she had turned her head toward the kitchen and called out, "Kim, would you do me a favour and call an ambulance?" "What's wrong?" asked Kim, hurrying to her. "I'm bleeding very fast," said Nancy calmly, "but it's nothing to get alarmed about. An extra heavy period, I guess. I just should go to the hospital right away, so please call the ambulance." The ambulance ride had been uneventful, without sirens or drama. She had to wait longer than she thought reasonable in the holding area of the emergency room. Dr. Major had appeared and for the first time awakened a feeling of gladness in Nancy. She had always detested the routine vaginal exams to which she had submitted, and had associated the face, the bearing, and the smell of Dr. Major with them. But when he appeared in the emergency room, she felt glad to see him, to the point of suppressing tears. The vaginal examination in the emergency room had been, without doubt, the worst she had ever experienced. A flimsy curtain, which was constantly being whisked back and forth, was the sole barrier between the throng in the emergency room and Nancy's flayed self-respect. Blood pressure was taken every few minutes. Blood was drawn. She had to change from her clothes into the hospital gown, and each time something was done, the curtain flashed aside and Nancy was confronted with an array of faces in white clothes, children with cuts, and old tired people. And there was the bedpan sitting there right in the open for everyone to gape at. It contained a large, semi-formed, dark red blood clot. Meanwhile, Dr. Major was down there between her legs, touching her and talking to the nurse about another case. Nancy closed her eyes as tightly as she could and cried silently. But it would all be over shortly, or so Dr. Major had promised. In great detail he had told Nancy about the lining of her uterus and how it changes during the normal cycle and what happens when it doesn't change. There was something about the blood vessels and the need for an egg to be released from the ovary. The definitive cure was a dilation and curettage. Nancy had agreed without question and asked that her parents not be notified. She could do that herself after the fact. She was sure her mother would think she had had to have an abortion. Now, as Nancy gazed up at the large overhead operating room light, the only thought that made her the slightest bit happy was the fact that the whole goddamn nightmare was going to be over within the hour, and her life would return to normal. The activity in the operating room was so totally foreign to her that she avoided looking at anyone or anything save for the light above. "Are you comfortable?" Nancy glanced to the right. Deep brown eyes regarded her from between the synthetic fibres of the surgical hood. Gloria Di Matteo was folding the drawer sheet around Nancy's right arm, securing it to her side and immobilizing her further. "Yes," answered Nancy with a certain detachment. Actually, she was uncomfortable as hell. The operating table was as hard as her cheap Formica kitchen table, but the Phenergan and Demerol she had been given were beginning to exert their effects somewhere within the depths of her cerebrum. Nancy was far more awake than she would have liked, but at the same time she was beginning to feel a detachment and disassociation from her surroundings. The atropine she had been given was having an effect as well, making her throat and mouth feel dry and her tongue sticky. Dr. Robert Billing was engrossed with his machine. It was a tangle of stainless steel, upright manometers, and a few colourful cylinders of compressed gas. A brown bottle of halothane stood on top of the machine. On the label was written 2-bromo 2-chloro-1,1,1 trifluorothane, C3HBr C1F3, an almost perfect anaesthetic agent. Almost, because every so often it seemed to destroy the patient's liver, but that rarely happened, and halothane's other characteristics far overshadowed the potential for liver damage. Dr. Billing was crazy about the stuff. Somewhere in his imagination he pictured himself developing halothane, introducing it to the medical community in the lead article of the New England Journal of Medicine, and then walking up to receive his Nobel Prize in the same tuxedo he had worn when he was married. Dr. Billing was a damned good anesthesiology resident, and he knew it. In fact, he thought most everyone knew it. He was convinced he knew as much about anesthesiology as most of the attendings, more than some. And he was careful, very careful. He had no serious complications as a resident, and that was indeed rare. Like a 747 pilot, he had made himself a checklist and religiously adhered to a policy of checking off each step at the induction procedure. This meant having xeroxed off 1,000 of the checklists and bringing a copy along with the other equipment at the start of each operation. By 7:15 the anesthesiologist was right on schedule at step number 12. That meant hooking up the rubber scuba-like tubing to the machine. One end went into the ventilating bag, whose 4 to 5 litre capacity afforded him an opportunity to inflate forcibly the patient's lungs at any time during the procedure. The other end went to the soda-lime canister, in which the patient's expired carbon dioxide would be absorbed. Step number 13 on his list was to make sure the unidirectional check valves in the breathing lines were lined up in the right direction. Step number 14 was to connect the anesthesia machine to the compressed air, nitrous oxide, and oxygen sources on the wall of the OR room. The anesthesia machine had emergency oxygen cylinders hanging from the side, and Dr. Billing checked the gauge pressures on both cylinders. They were fully charged. Dr. Billing felt fine. "I'm going to place some electrodes on your chest so we can monitor your heart," said Gloria Di Matteo, while pulling down the sheet and pulling up the hospital gown, exposing Nancy's midriff to the sterile air. The gown just barely covered Nancy's nipples. "This will feel cold for a sec," added Gloria Di Matteo, as she squeezed a bit of colourless jelly onto 3 locations on Nancy's exposed lower chest. Nancy wanted to say something, but she couldn't deal rapidly enough with her ambivalent attitudes about what she was experiencing. She was grateful because it was going to help her, or so she had been assured. She was furious because she felt so exposed, literally and figuratively. "You're going to feel a little stick now," said Dr. Billing, slapping the back of Nancy's left hand to make the veins stand out. He had placed a piece of rubber tubing tightly around Nancy's wrist, and she could feel her heart beat in the tips of her fingers. It was all happening too fast for Nancy to assimilate. "Good morning, Miss Greenley," said an ebullient Dr. Major as he whisked through the OR door. "I hope you had a good night's sleep. We'll get this affair over with in a few minutes and have you back to your bed for a restful sleep." Before Nancy could respond, the nerves from the tissues on the back of her hand became alive with urgent messages for her pain center. After the initial thrust, the intensity of the pain increased to a point and then dissipated. The snug rubber tourniquet disappeared and blood surged into Nancy's hand. She felt tears well up from within her head. "IV," said Dr. Billing to no one as he made a blade check next to number 16 on his list. "You'll be going to sleep shortly, Nancy," continued Dr. Major. "Isn't that right, Dr. Billing? Nancy, you're a lucky girl today. Dr. Billing is number 1. Dr. Major called all his patients girls, no matter what age they were. It was one of those condescending mannerisms he had adopted unquestioningly from his older partner. "That's correct," said Dr. Billing, placing a rubber mask on the anesthesia tubing. "Number 8 tube. Gloria, please. And you, Dr. Major, can scrub. We'll be ready at 7:30 sharp." "Okay," said Dr. Major, heading for the door. Pausing, he turned to Ruth Jenkins, who was setting up the Mayo stand with instruments. "I want my own dilators and curettes, Ruth. Last time you gave me that medieval rubbish that belongs to the house." He was gone before the nurse could answer. Somewhere behind her, Nancy could hear the sonar-like beep of the cardiac monitor. It was her own heart rhythm resounding in the room. "All right, Nancy," said Gloria. "I want you to slide down the table a bit and put your legs up here in the stirrups." Gloria grasped Nancy's legs in turn under the knees and lifted them up into the stainless steel stirrups. The sheet slid between Nancy's legs, exposing them from mid-thigh down. The lower part of the table fell away, and the sheet slid to the floor. Nancy closed her eyes and tried not to picture herself spread-eagled on the table. Gloria picked up the sheet and haphazardly put it on Nancy's abdomen so that it draped between her legs, covering her bloodied and recently shaved perineum. Nancy wanted to be calm, but she was getting more and more anxious. She wanted to be grateful, but the tide was swinging more and more in the direction of the undirected anger and emotion. "I'm not sure I want to go through with this," said Nancy, looking at Dr. Billing. "Everything is just fine," said Dr. Billing in an artificially concerned tone of voice, while checking off number 18 on his list. "You'll be asleep in a jiffy," he added, while holding up a syringe and tapping it so that the bubbles all fled upward to the room air. "I'm going to give you some pentothal right away. Don't you feel sleepy now?" "No," said Nancy. "Well, you should have told me," said Dr. Billing. "I don't know how I'm supposed to feel," returned Nancy. "It's all right now," said Dr. Billing, pulling his anesthesia machine close to Nancy's head. With well-rehearsed adeptness, he attached his pentothal syringe to the 3-way valve on the IV line. "Now I want you to count to 50 for me, Nancy." He expected that Nancy would never get past 15. In fact, it gave Dr. Billing a certain sense of satisfaction to watch the patient go to sleep. It represented repetitive proof for him of the validity of the scientific method. Besides, it made him feel powerful. It was as if he had command of the patient's brain. Nancy was a strong-willed individual, however, and although she wanted to go to sleep, her brain involuntarily fought against the drug. She was still audibly counting when Dr. Billing gave an additional dose of pentothal. She said 27 before the 2 grams of the drug succeeded in inducing sleep. Nancy Greenlee fell asleep at 7:24 on February the 14th, 1976, for the last time. Dr. Billing had no idea this healthy young woman was going to be his first major complication. He was confident that everything was under control. The list was almost complete. He had Nancy breathe a mixture of halothane nitrous oxide and oxygen gen through a mask. Then he injected 2 cc's of a 0.2% succinylcholine chloride solution into Nancy's IV to effect a paralysis of all her skeletal muscles. This would make the placement of the endotracheal tube in the trachea easier. It would also allow Dr. Major to perform a bimanual exam to rule out ovarian pathology. The effect of the succinylcholine was seen almost immediately. At first there were minute fasciculations of the muscles of the face, then the abdomen. As the bloodstream sped the drug throughout the body, the motor and end plates of the muscles became depolarized, and total paralysis of the skeletal muscles occurred. Smooth muscles, like the heart, were unaffected, and the beat from the monitor continued without a waver. Nancy's tongue was paralyzed and it fell back, blocking her airway. But that didn't matter. The muscles of the thorax and abdomen were paralyzed as well, and any attempt at breathing ceased. Although chemically different from the curare of the Amazon savages, the drug had the same effect, and Nancy would have died in 5 minutes. But at this point nothing was wrong. Dr. Billing was in total control. The effect was expected and desirable. Outwardly calm, inwardly very tense, Dr. Billing put down the breathing mask and reached for the laryngoscope, step number 22 on his list. With the tip of the blade he pulled the tongue forward and manoeuvred past the white epiglottis, whilst he visualized the entrance to the trachea. The vocal cords were ajar, paralyzed, and the rest of the skeletal muscles. Swiftly Dr. Billing squirted some topical anesthetic into the trachea, followed by the endotracheal tube. The laryngoscope made a characteristic metallic snap as Dr. Billing folded the blade onto the handle. With the help of a small syringe he inflated the cuff of the endotracheal tube, providing a seal. Quickly he attached the tip of the rubber hose, without the face mask, to open end of the endotracheal tube. As he compressed the ventilating bag, Nancy's chest rose in a symmetrical fashion. Dr. Billing listened to Nancy's chest with his stethoscope and was pleased. The intubation had been as characteristically smooth as expected. He was in total control of the patient's respiratory state. He adjusted his flow meters and set the combination of halothane, nitrous oxide, and oxygen he wanted. A few pieces of tape secured the endotracheal tube. A twist of the finger adjusted the IV rate. Dr. Billing's own heart began to slow down. He never showed it, but he always got very tense during the intubation procedure. With the patient paralyzed, one has to work fast and do it right. With a nod, Dr. Billing indicated that Gloria de Matteo could begin the prep of Nancy's shaved perineum. Meanwhile, Dr. Billing began to make himself comfortable for the case. His job was now reduced to close observation of the patient's vital signs: heart rate and rhythm, blood pressure and temperature. As long as the patient was paralyzed, he had to compress the ventilating bag to breathe the patient. The succinylcholine would wear off in 8 to 10 minutes. Then the patient could breathe herself, and the anesthesiologist could relax. Nancy's blood pressure stayed at 105/70. The pulse had steadily fallen from the anxiety state prior to anesthesia to a comfortable 72 beats per minute. Dr. Billing was happy, and he looked forward to a coffee break in about 40 minutes. The case went smoothly. Dr. Major did his bimanual examination and asked for some more relaxation. This meant that Nancy's blood had detoxified the succinylcholine given during the intubation. Billing was happy to give another 2 cc's. He dutifully recorded this in his anesthesia record. The result was immediate, and Dr. Major thanked Dr. Billing and informed the crew that the ovaries felt like little smooth normal plums. He always said that when he felt normal ovaries. The dilation of the cervix went without a hitch. Nancy had a normally anteroflexed uterus, and the curve of the dilators was a perfect match. A few blood clots were sucked out from the vaginal vault with the suction machine. Dr. Major carefully curetted the inside of the uterus, noting the consistency of the endometrial tissue. As Dr. Major passed the second curette, Dr. Billing noted a slight change in the rhythm of the cardiac monitor. He watched the electronic blip trace across the oscilloscope screen. The pulse fell to about 60. Instinctively, he inflated the blood pressure cuff and listened intently for the familiar, far-away, deep sound of the blood surging through the collapsed artery. As the air pressure drained off more, he heard the rebound sound indicating the diastolic pressure. The blood pressure was 90/60. This was not terribly low, but it puzzled his analytical brain. Could Nancy be getting some vagal feedback from her uterus? He wondered. He doubted it, but just the same he took the stethoscope from his ears. "Dr. Major, could you hold on for a minute? The blood pressure has sagged a little. How much blood loss do you estimate?" "Couldn't be more than 500 cc, said Dr. Major, looking up from between Nancy's legs. "That's funny," said Dr. Billing, replacing the stethoscope in his ears. He inflated the cuff again. Blood pressure was 90/58. He looked at the monitor. Pulse 60. "What's the pressure?" asked Dr. Major. 90/60, with a pulse of 60, said Dr. Billing, taking the stethoscope from his ears and rechecking the flow valves on the anesthesia machine. "What the hell's wrong with that, for Christ's sake?" snapped Dr. Major, showing some early surgical irritation. "Nothing," agreed Dr. Billing, "but it's a change. She'd been so steady." "Well, her colour is fantastic down here. She's as red as a cherry," said Dr. Major, laughing at his own joke. No one else laughed. Dr. Billing looked at the clock. It was 7:48. "Okay, go ahead. I'll tell you if she changes any more," said Dr. Billing, while giving the breathing bag a healthy squeeze to inflate Nancy's lungs maximally. Something was bothering Dr. Billing. Something was keying off his sixth sense, activating his adrenals and pushing up his own heart rate. He watched the breathing bag sag and remained still. He compressed it again, mentally recording the degree of resistance afforded by Nancy's bronchial tubes and lungs. She was very easy to breathe. He watched the bag again. No motion, no respiratory effect on Nancy's part, despite the fact that the second dose of 6-succinylcholine should have been metabolized by then. The blood pressure came up slightly, then went down again, 80/58. The monotonous beep of the monitor skipped once. Dr. Billing's eyes shot to the oscilloscope screen. The rhythm picked up again. "I'll be finished here in 5 minutes, said Dr. Major for Dr. Billing's benefit. With a sense of relief, Dr. Billing reached over and turned down both the nitrous oxide and the halothane flow, while turning up the oxygen. He wanted to lighten Nancy's level of anesthesia. The blood pressure came up to 90/60, and Dr. Billing felt a little better. He even allowed himself the luxury of running the back of his hand across his forehead to scatter the beads of perspiration that had appeared as evidence of his increasing anxiety. He glanced at the soda-lime CO2 absorber. It appeared normal. Time was 7:56. With his right hand he reached up and lifted Nancy's eyelids. They moved with no resistance, and the pupils were maximally dilated. The fear returned to Dr. Billing in a rush. Something was wrong. Something was very wrong. Monday, February 23rd, 7:15 a.m. Several small flakes of snow danced down Longwood Avenue in the half-light of February 23rd, 1976. The temperature was a crisp 20 degrees, and the delicate crystalline structures fluttering earthward were intact even after striking the pavement. The sun was obscured by a low cover of thick grey clouds which shrouded the waking city. More and more clouds were swept in by the sea breeze, enveloping the tops of the taller buildings in a mist, making it become paradoxically darker as dawn spread its fragile fingers over Boston. It was not supposed to snow, yet a few flakes had crystallized over Cohasset and had blown all the way into the city. The few that reached Longwood Avenue and were blown right on Avenue Louis Pasteur were the survivors until a sudden downdraft slammed them against a third-story window of the medical school dorm. They would have slid off had it not been for the layer of greasy Boston grime on the pane. Instead, they stuck there while the glass slowly transmitted the heat from within, and their delicate bodies dissolved and mingled with the dirt. Within her room, Susan Wheeler was totally unaware of the drama on the window pane. Her mind was preoccupied with extricating itself from the clutches of a meaningless, disturbing dream after a restless, near-sleepless night. February 23rd was going to be a difficult day at best, and possibly a disaster. Medical school is made up of 1,000 minor crises, occasionally interrupted by truly epochal upheavals. February 23rd was in the latter category for Susan Wheeler. 5 days earlier she had completed the first 2 years of medical school. The basic science part taught in the lecture halls and science labs with books and other inanimate objects. Susan Wheeler had done very well because she could handle the classroom, the lab, and the papers. Her class notes were renowned, and people always wanted to borrow them. At first she lent them indiscriminately. Later, as she began to perceive the realities of the competitive system which she thought she had left behind in Radcliffe, she changed her tactics. She lent her notes only to a small group of people who were her friends, or at least were people from whom she could borrow notes if she had to miss a class. But she rarely missed a class. A number of people chided Susan playfully about her marvellous attendance record. She always responded by saying she needed all the help she could get. Of course, that was not the reason. Having entered a profession dominated by males, in which essentially all the professors and instructors were males, Susan Wheeler could not skip a class without being missed. Despite the fact that Susan looked on her mentors in a neutral, sexless way as her professional superiors, they did not return the view in kind. The fact of the matter was that Susan Wheeler was a very attractive 23-year-old female. Her hair was the colour of winter wheat and very wispy. Since it was long and fine, it drove her batty in the wind unless she had it pulled back and clasped with a barrette at the back of her head. From there it fell in a sheen to the lower edges of her shoulder blades. Her face was broad with high cheekbones, and her eyes, set well back in their sockets, were a mixture of blue and green with flecks of brown, so that the chromatic effect changed with different light sources. Her teeth were ultra white and perfectly straight, the result of 50% nature and 50% suburbanite orthodontist. All in all, Susan Wheeler appeared like the girl of a Pepsi-Cola people's dreams. At 23 years old she was young, healthy and sexy with that American California style that made eyes turn and hypothalamuses awaken. And on top of it all, perhaps in spite of it all, Susan Wheeler was very sharp. Her grammar school IQ ratings had hovered around the 140 range and were a source of infinite delight to her socially committed parents. Her school record was a monotonous series of A's with numerous other evidences of achievement. Susan liked school and learning and revelled in using her brain. She read voraciously. Radcliffe had been perfect for her. She did well, but she earned her grades. She had majored in chemistry, but had taken as much literature as possible. She had no trouble getting into medical school. But being attractive as Susan was, had certain definite drawbacks. One was the difficulty of missing class without being noticed. Whenever questions were asked, she was among those unfortunate few who served to demonstrate the stupidity of the students or the brilliance of the professors. Another drawback was that people formed opinions about Susan. The very little information She so resembled models glaring out from advertisements that people continuously confused her with these frequently mindless girls. There were advantages, though, to being bright and beautiful, and Susan was slowly beginning to realize that it was reasonable to exploit them to a degree. If she needed a further explanation regarding some complicated topic, she only had to ask once. Instructors and professors alike would hasten to help Susan understand a fine point of endocrinology or a subtle point of anatomy. Socially, Susan did not date as much as people imagined she would. The explanation for this paradox was several-fold. First, Susan preferred reading in her room to a boring date, and with her intelligence, Susan found quite a few men boring. Second, few men actually asked Susan out, just because Susan's combination of beauty and brains was a bit intimidating. Susan some otherwise. Starting February 23rd, Susan feared her comfortable world was going to be blown up. The familiar lecture routine was over. Susan Wheeler and 122 of her classmates were being rudely weaned from the security of the inanimate and tossed into the arena of the clinical years. All the confidence in one's abilities formed during the basic science years were hardly proof against the uncertainties of actual patient care. Susan Wheeler had no illusions concerning the fact that she knew nothing about actually being a doctor, about taking care of real-life patients. Inwardly, she doubted that she ever would. It wasn't something she could read about and assimilate intellectually. The idea of trial by fire was diametrically opposed to her basic mythology. Yet on February the 23rd, she was going to have to deal with patients some way, somehow. It was this crisis of confidence that made sleep difficult for her and filled the night with bizarre, disturbing dreams in which she found herself wandering through foreign mazes searching for horrible goals. Susan had no idea how closely her dreams would approximate her experience during the next few days. At 7:15, the mechanical click of the clock radio broke her dream's feedback circuit, and Susan's brain awakened to full consciousness. She turned off the radio before the transistors had a chance to fill the room with raucous folk music. Normally she relied on the music to wake her, but on this particular morning she needed little assistance. She was too keyed up. Susan put her feet on the floor and sat on the edge of the bed. The floor was cold and uninviting. Her hair descended from her head haphazardly, leaving only a 2 to 3 inch gap through which to regard her room. It wasn't much of a room, about 12 by 14 feet, with 2 multi-paned windows at the end. The windows gave out onto another brick building and a parking lot, so that Susan rarely looked out. The paint was reasonably fresh, because she had painted the room herself about 2 years previously. The colour was a pleasing pastel yellow, which accented perfectly the Marimekko Printex fabric she had used to make the curtains. Their colours were several shades of electric green, separated by dark blue. On the walls hung a variety of coloured posters, framed with stainless steel, advertising past cultural events. The furniture was medical school issue. There was an old-fashioned single bed, which was too soft and difficult for entertaining. There was a worn, overstuffed easy chair, which Susan never used save for depositing dirty laundry. Susan liked to read on the bed and study at the desk, so that the easy chair really wasn't critical, in her words. The desk was oak and ordinary except for the pattern of initials and scratches carved in the top. In its right corner, Susan had even found a few obscene words associated with the word biochem. A physical diagnosis book was open on the desk. During the last 3 days she had totally reread it, but the text had failed to buoy her sagging confidence. "Shit," she said out loud, with little inflection. The remark was directed at no one and at nothing. It was a basal response as she comprehended that February 23rd had indeed arrived. Susan liked to swear, and she did it a lot, but mostly to herself, since such language contrasted sharply with her wholesome image. The effect was truly remarkable. She had found it a useful and entertaining tool. Having pulled herself from the warmth of her covers with such dispatch, Susan realized that she had an extra 15 minutes to spare. That was the usual duration of her ritual of repeatedly turning off her radio alarm before actually making it into the bathroom. Her ambivalence towards starting this day made her squander the time by just sitting and staring ahead, wishing that she had gone to law school or graduate school in literature, anything besides medical school. The coldness of the bare waxed floor worked its way into Susan's feet. As she sat there, her circulatory system dissipated her body heat into the cold room, making her nipples rise up from the summits of her shapely breasts. Goose pimples appeared from nowhere along the insides of her naked thighs. She wore only a thin, worn-out flannel nightgown she had gotten for Christmas when she was in the 5th grade. She still wore it to bed almost every night, at least when she was sleeping alone. Somehow she loved that nightgown. Amid the furious pace of change in her life, it seemed to afford a sanctuary of consistency. Besides, it had always been her father's favourite. Susan had enjoyed pleasing her father from a very early age. Her first remembrance of him was his smell, a mixture of the outdoors and deodorant soap, covering a distinctive odour she later realized was male. He had always been good to her, and she knew that she was his favourite. That secret she never shared with anyone, especially not with her 2 younger brothers. It had always been a source of confidence for her as she faced the usual hurdles of childhood and adolescence. Susan's father was a strong-willed individual, a dominant, generous and gentle man who ran his family and his insurance business like an enlightened depot. A charming man whose brood acknowledged him as the last word on the subject. It wasn't that Susan's mother was a weak-willed individual. It was just that she had met more than her match in the man she married. For much of her life Susan accepted this situation as the invariable norm. Eventually, however, it began to cause her some inner confusion. Susan was very much like her father, and her father encouraged her development in that direction. Then Susan began to realize she could not be like her father, and expect one day to have a home, her own, like the one in which she was reared. For a time she wanted desperately to be like her mother, and consciously tried, but it was to no avail. Her personality showed more and more her father's traits, and in high school she was literally forced into a leadership role. Susan was voted president of her graduating class at a time in her life when she thought that she would have preferred to be more in the background. Susan's father was never particularly demanding, and certainly never pushy. He remained a source of confidence and encouragement for Susan to do whatever she wanted without considering her sex. After Susan had entered medical school and become familiar with some of her female classmates, she realized that many of them had emerged from a similar paternalistic background. In fact, when she met some of their parents, the fathers seemed to be vaguely familiar, as if she had actually known them in the past. A resonant thumping issued from the radiator beneath the window, heralding the coming of heat. A tiny bit of steam hissed from the overflow valve. The radiator's stirring reminded Susan of the coldness of the room. Stiffly she stood up, stretched, and closed the window. It had been open only about half an inch. Susan lifted the nightgown over her head and regarded her naked body in the mirror on the bathroom door. Mirrors held a strange attraction for her. It was almost impossible for her to pass a mirror without at least a quick, reassuring look. "Maybe you should have been a dancer, Susan Wheeler," she said, rising up onto her tiptoes and stretching her arms straight up, "and give up this idea of becoming a fucking doctor." Like a balloon being deflated, she let herself sag until she was slumped over. She was still looking at herself in the mirror. I wish I could do that, she added more quietly. Susan was proud of her body. It was soft and supple, yet strong and well tuned. She could have been a dancer. She had good balance, and she was filled with a sense of rhythm and movement. She envied Carla Curtis, a friend from Radcliffe who had gone into dance after college and was somewhere in the New York world. But Susan knew she could not actually go into dance, despite her fantasy about it. She needed a vocation which would constantly exercise her brain. Susan made a horrible grimace and stuck her tongue out at the girl in the mirror, who did the same. Then Susan went into the bathroom. In the bathroom she turned on the shower. It took 4 or 5 minutes to get hot. She looked at her face in the bathroom mirror, after shaking her hair from her line of sight. If only her nose had been made a little more narrow, she thought that she would be quite attractive. Then she started her bathroom routine with 1 lavender tablet of Ortho Novum. Among her other characteristics, Susan Wheeler was a practical woman, strong-willed and practical. And that's the end of Coma chapter 1. And if you want to read the rest, you can find the details on where to buy it down in the description. Please do. Robin Cook is my favourite author and is well worth a read. Again, please like and subscribe. If you have noticed, I have been starting to put whole books on now. I think I started with Frankenstein. We are going to put War of the Worlds on, so look out for that. And until next time, take care. Bye.